She was tied to a post like a servant at her own family's gala, until a mysterious Rolls-Royce arrived, and everything changed. The man who stepped out silenced the crowd with 5 words, "This woman is my wife." What followed was a stunning revelation that turned humiliation into triumph. This isn't just a story of betrayal, it's a powerful comeback you won't forget. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments and subscribe for more life-changing stories. They say the Bellamy estate was a slice of paradise carved into the Carolina hills. Neatly trimmed hedges lined the drive like obedient soldiers, fountains danced in marble basins, and the whitewashed mansion gleamed in the sunlight like a courthouse that had swallowed its own conscience. But for me, Naomi Blake, it was never home. It was a museum I was forced to live in, a place where beauty was curated and compassion was just another item on display, behind glass. I was brought there at 5 years old, days after a drunk driver ran a red light and killed the only person who ever loved me. My mother, Deja Blake, a single parent and gifted music student who worked night shifts cleaning medical labs just to pay for our food, died clutching my car seat. I remember the crash in flashes. Glass like starlight, my mother's hand, the cold metal of the hospital cot. When I woke, I was told that a very generous family had offered to take me in. That family was the Bellamies. Judge Franklin Bellamy was a towering man with silver hair and a voice tuned for courtrooms, not lullabies. His wife, Celeste, never once raised her tone, but her silence could strip paint. They had 2 biological children, Meredith and Graham, both golden-haired and camera-ready, already being groomed for Ivy Leagues and magazine covers. Me? I was the dark stain they tried to call a signature. The day they picked me up, I was dressed in an itchy navy dress someone from the church had donated. Celeste smiled like she was posing for a charity flyer. "We'll take good care of her," she said to the social worker, who nodded like this was a fairy tale's ending. But the moment the front door closed behind us, I knew the story was very different. No one knelt to my eye level. No one said, "Welcome home." Instead, I was led up a winding staircase to a pristine guest room with white curtains and a canopy bed I wasn't allowed to touch without supervision. "Don't move the pillows," Celeste warned, her voice soft but stern. "They're decorative." They told me to call them Mr. and Mrs. Bellamy. When I tried Mom once, Celeste paused with her hand on a teacup and said, "Let's not confuse roles, Naomi. You're our guest." I learned quickly not to repeat that mistake. Everything about life at Bellamy House was a lesson in polished cruelty. The meals were quiet affairs, where Meredith bragged about ballet recitals and Graham quoted Supreme Court justices. I was expected to be grateful. For the food I wasn't allowed to choose, for the education they didn't let me talk about at dinner, for the roof they reminded me wasn't really mine. Once in middle school, I won a statewide essay contest. I came home clutching the certificate like it was gold. Franklin looked over his paper and said, "You're not obligated to announce every minor achievement, Naomi." That night, the certificate ended up in my desk drawer, beneath 3 sweaters that still smelled like charity. Their affection was the performative kind, pulled out only for guests or fundraising galas. "Our Naomi," they would say, patting my shoulder like I was a decorative pet. "She's such a lovely addition to the family." But in every family photo, I was either placed at the edge or missing altogether. On one Christmas card, I noticed they'd lightened the background so much my face all but disappeared. My skin was a constant topic of micro-commentary. Celeste once joked that my complexion was the color of a fine mocha, which made me feel like a beverage, not a girl. They insisted on chemically straightening my hair every month. "It's for your own good," Celeste would say, pressing the hot comb while I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from crying. "So you don't look wild." The word clung to me like a label I couldn't scrub off. Even in private, their kindness had an expiration date. When I asked to join the debate team in high school, Franklin raised an eyebrow. "Debate," he repeated. "Your voice lacks the kind of weight those judges listen for. Try art club. It's gentler." I did try art club, once. But after Meredith saw one of my charcoal sketches and called it aggressively urban, I quit. By the time I was 16, I had stopped asking questions. I moved like wallpaper, present but unnoticeable. I got straight A's, volunteered at the library, and learned to navigate the Bellamy household like a silent ghost. I managed their receipts, updated their spreadsheets, even corrected Meredith's business plan for her social startup without asking for credit. I wasn't thanked, I wasn't seen, but I had my plan. In the cracks between chores and forced smiles, I built my own life. I applied for college scholarships without their help. I worked weekends at a used bookstore, saving every cent in a secret account. I kept a second savings jar tucked behind the bookshelf in my room, labeled Exit. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I wouldn't stay. Then came the week of the Winter Fundraiser, the one where the governor's wife attended. Celeste handed me a list of wines to polish and a dress code memo for staff. I was 17. I had studied for midterms that week while covering for their caterer's absence. When a guest complimented the hors d'oeuvres and Meredith smiled and said, "Naomi helped with those," I nearly cried. Not because she said my name, but because for a split second, I thought she might finally see me. She didn't. Later that night, I overheard her whispering to Graham in the hallway. She should be thankful. We gave her everything. And she still walks like she's got something to prove. Graham chuckled. She's a charity write-off with opinions, dangerous combination. That night, I lay awake, watching the chandelier flicker above me. I counted each crystal, pretending they were stars and that I could name a future after each one. I promised myself one day they will learn who I am. Not by shouting, not by begging, but by becoming someone they can't ignore. But I never imagined it would end the way it did. With silk rope, with laughter, and with Elijah. I didn't leave the Bellamy estate in a storm of slammed doors or angry words. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic exit. I simply faded out of their frame, just as they had always taught me to do. But what they didn't realize was that every quiet step I took away from their perfect halls was a step toward something louder, braver, and entirely my own. College was my first taste of real air. I went to a public university 6 states away on a full scholarship, choosing distance over prestige. I shared a dorm with 2 other girls who didn't care that I made coffee before sunrise or that I color-coded my books. I worked nights at the library and weekends as a receptionist at a dental clinic, scrubbing bathroom floors between shifts, grading papers as a tutor when time allowed. I never had time for parties or road trips. Freedom, for me, wasn't wild. It was focused. I sent holiday cards to the Bellamies during those first years. They never wrote back. But every year, like clockwork, I received a request from Celeste asking for help organizing the estate's annual fundraiser, or a last-minute email from Meredith asking me to take a quick look at her pitch deck. I always helped, not because I owed them anything, but because I knew I could. There was a twisted satisfaction in fixing the cracks in their empire with hands they refused to acknowledge. It was during my final year, in the beige-lit halls of a tech conference in Washington, D.C., that I met Elijah Hart. He was standing alone by the coffee table, staring down a decaf label like it had insulted his ancestors. We both reached for the last donut at the same time. His fingers touched mine, and we both froze, then laughed. He was tall, with soft edges and sharp eyes, dressed in a button-down that hadn't been ironed properly, and shoes that had walked too far for someone attending a networking event. We made small talk, then sat at the back of a workshop neither of us had planned to attend. He told me he'd pitched his startup to 17 investors that week. All 17 had said no. I told him I'd corrected my roommate's thesis for free, and she submitted it without changing the name. We both laughed again, tired, cynical, knowing laughs. We exchanged emails, then emails turned into long messages. Then messages turned into voice notes, sent at midnight when the world felt too heavy. I learned that Elijah had grown up in Baltimore, raised by his grandmother after his parents vanished into the system. He coded because it made sense when nothing else did. He built software for equity tracking and community development, and not a single VC had the patience to understand what that meant. I saw in him what I had always wanted someone to see in me. Potential shaped by pressure, ambition tempered by kindness, a refusal to quit no matter how many doors slammed shut. He never asked me about the Bellamies. He only asked about me, what books I liked, how I took my tea, whether I'd ever danced barefoot in the rain. The answer was no. I told him I didn't have time for things like that. He said we'd make time. We met in person, again 3 months later, He came to see me after I gave a presentation on microlending strategies for underserved urban communities. I wore a thrifted blazer and nearly tripped on the stage stairs. He clapped the loudest. That weekend, we walked through the city with no destination. We got caught in a thunderstorm and didn't run. I danced barefoot in the rain, laughing like the wind had finally gotten inside my chest. He watched me with that look, the kind that says, "There you are." And just like that, I was found. We didn't talk about love in big dramatic ways. It wasn't a whirlwind. It was steady, like the tide, pulling me toward him with every conversation, every quiet meal, every wordless ride on the train when we sat shoulder to shoulder. By the time Elijah's startup finally found the right investor, an education nonprofit based in Chicago, we were already sharing keys, passwords, groceries, and the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. When we got married, it was under a sycamore tree in a public park, with no one in attendance but a childhood friend of his and my old college professor who had become like a father to me. I wore a linen dress I bought off a clearance rack. He wore his favorite black sneakers. We wrote our vows in a diner that morning while sharing pancakes. I didn't tell the Bellamies, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I knew they wouldn't understand. Elijah was everything they had tried to keep out of their world. Black, self-made, unafraid of messy truths. And more than that, he was mine. Our love didn't need their approval. It didn't even need their awareness. While Elijah's startup soared, I quietly built my own organization, Roots Ledger, a data platform that helped small-scale entrepreneurs in marginalized neighborhoods track microloans, credit histories, and legal documents. It wasn't flashy, it didn't get written up in glossy magazines, but it mattered. It saved lives in slow, quiet ways, like mending a seam before it tears. Ironically, as I climbed higher, the Bellamies began to descend. Franklin Bellamy's name came up in a campaign ethics investigation. Meredith's social branding firm hemorrhaged clients after a failed product launch involving a charity-branded perfume line. Graham's law firm nearly closed after a client scandal and a string of bad investments. And one by one, the calls started again. Subtle at first. Meredith needed help with tax strategy. Celeste asked if I knew a CPA who could review the estate's books. Graham sent me a frantic message asking about liability structures. They didn't know I had already been paying off parts of their second mortgage, donating anonymously through shell foundations tied to my nonprofit. I'd even covered a private lien on their estate's landscaping debt. They never once asked how I was doing. They never mentioned Elijah. But they took the lifeline anyway, and I gave it. Not out of love, but closure. Some part of me still believed that if I just kept them from collapsing, they might change. That the people who once treated me as a ghost might finally see the woman standing in front of them. But I was wrong. People don't change because you carry their weight. They change only when the floor beneath them disappears. That floor would vanish soon, and when it did, they would learn exactly what I had become. Not their burden, but their reckoning. I remember the day Elijah and I signed our marriage license like it happened yesterday. It wasn't some grand affair with champagne toasts and string quartets echoing through marble halls. It was just us, two people with tired eyes and full hearts, standing under the shadow of a courthouse, hands clasped like lifelines, the ink of our signatures still drying as the wind picked up dust along the steps. He squeezed my fingers after the judge pronounced us husband and wife. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, but I couldn't find the words. Not because I wasn't happy. God, I was. But because deep down, I knew this moment would never be recognized by the people who raised me. The Bellamies would never understand why I married a man who didn't wear silk cufflinks, who laughed too loudly, who loved me in ways that didn't involve conditions or performance. They would never know that Elijah was the first man who looked me in the eye and saw me, not a symbol. And I would never ask for their blessing, because it would come wrapped in guilt. Like everything else they gave. We moved to Seattle after the wedding. He had meetings with education boards and developers, and I had a growing network of community organizers eager to build with me. We rented a modest loft with exposed brick and windows that caught the rain in beautiful, moody streaks. The kind of place where the sound of traffic became background music and the scent of morning coffee soaked into the walls like memory. Our routine was simple. Wake, work, cook together when we could, fall asleep on the couch halfway through documentaries we never finished. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't meant to be, it was ours. And in that quiet chapter, something inside me started to breathe again. But peace never comes without echoes. The Bellamy's shadows crept back slowly, an email here, a forwarded invoice there. The estate had fallen into deeper debt, a garden renovation left half paid, a donor lawsuit quietly settled. Meredith's branding agency had been blacklisted from 3 major clients. The same girl who once called me a social experiment now reached out under the guise of asking for advice. "Naomi, you've always been good with numbers. I just need someone discreet to take a look at the foundation books." I said nothing about my marriage. I said nothing about Elijah. I simply agreed to help, knowing full well I had already been helping for years behind the scenes. You see, the Bellamies never realized the cost of silence. They never asked how those overdue tax bills disappeared or why foreclosure notices suddenly stopped arriving. They assumed a benefactor, maybe some miracle or luck. They never thought to look at the woman they once dressed in beige and instructed to stay in the background. I used a network of holding companies and anonymous donations through my nonprofit. No one could trace it back to me, not even Graham, whose own firm had unknowingly benefited from a legal reform initiative I'd championed. I cleared the second mortgage on the estate. I covered the estate tax penalties. I arranged a quiet deal with a private investor to buy the liens on their family vineyard. I did it all without expecting a thank you. But there was a moment, just one, when I almost said no. It was after Franklin sent a request for help refinancing a legacy trust he'd mismanaged. The email had no greeting, no question, just need this resolved before the end of the quarter. No Naomi, how are you? No thank you for your time. I stared at the screen for an hour. Elijah walked in, drying his hands with a dish towel. He leaned over and kissed my shoulder. "Let them fall," he said softly. "You don't owe them scaffolding." But I wasn't trying to save them for them. I was saving them for me. I didn't want to be like them, cold, indifferent, transactional. I didn't want to grow into the kind of woman who let people drown just because they once tried to sink her. Maybe, foolishly, I still believed that if I held the family together, the people inside it might learn how to be whole. Maybe I thought redemption could be contagious. But nothing changed. They still corrected my tone in emails. They still forwarded requests with no context, assuming I would sort it out. Meredith once referred to me as her consultant, as if I hadn't personally written the funding proposal that saved her firm from bankruptcy. And then came the gala. I found the invitation on the kitchen counter at the Bellamy estate during one of my rare visits. I had returned to North Carolina for a site inspection on a local shelter my nonprofit was helping expand. I decided to stop by, half out of nostalgia, half obligation. Celeste greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh good, you're here. We're finalizing the details for the Legacy Gala. It's going to be quite the affair." The invitation was printed on thick cream paper, with gold lettering and embossed ivy along the edges. "Celebrating a legacy of generosity and leadership," it read. The guest list boasted politicians, journalists, celebrities. The Bellamy name stretched across every banner like a badge of honor. My name, of course, wasn't on the agenda. When I mentioned it that evening over dinner, Franklin didn't even look up from his wine glass. "Why would your name be there?" he asked, bored. "I coordinated the grant partnerships. The foundation wouldn't even exist without, because we allowed you to operate under our umbrella," Meredith cut in, dabbing her lips with a napkin. "That's a privilege, Naomi, not a right." I nodded, calmly, excused myself, went upstairs. That night, Elijah texted me. He knew the gala date, he knew the history. "Still want to go through with this?" I stared at those words for a long time. Then I typed back one word. Yes, because I was done stitching up their legacy while mine unraveled in silence. I was done dimming myself so they could shine brighter. Let them have their audience. Let them wear pearls and pose beside fountains. Let them toast to a history they never earned. I was going to show up. I was going to let them reveal who they really were. And then I was going to take everything back. Not with noise, not with rage, but with truth and silence sharp enough to cut marble. The day of the gala arrived with a kind of suffocating stillness, the sky already pulsing with heat before the sun had even broken the horizon. I hadn't slept. I didn't need to. My mind had stopped chasing sleep hours ago and had instead settled into something sharper. Clarity, maybe? Or resolve. There was no trembling, no second-guessing, only the weight of knowing exactly what I was about to walk into. The Bellamy estate was a hive of motion that morning. Hired staff buzzed through the halls, balancing trays of delicate glassware, arranging silver-rimmed menus on crisp white linens, and fluffing hydrangeas imported from God knows where. The chandeliers had been polished, the garden sculpted into a magazine spread. It was a performance, like everything else they did. I moved quietly through it, unnoticed, unbothered, just another figure in the background. There was a chart taped to the kitchen refrigerator with assigned stations for the servers. It was coded by color, not by name. I found mine. Station 4. Wine service, rear patio, of course. No introductions, no acknowledgement, just function. Just like always. The uniform they handed me was beige, a shapeless dress that matched the tablecloths and did everything it could to erase my presence. No name tag, no voice, just cloth and silence. I didn't argue. I slipped it on like armor, even as it clung to me like a mockery of everything I had built on my own. I could have said no. I could have walked out that very moment and spared myself what I knew was coming. But I stayed, because the truth had a time and a place, and it wasn't in whispers. It was meant to be heard in rooms like this, in front of faces like theirs, at tables built on money I had silently saved them from losing. By early afternoon, the guests began to arrive. Luxury sedans glided up the circular drive, attendants opening doors with synchronized grace. The air filled with the low hum of cocktail laughter and camera shutters. Men in linen suits and women in pastel gowns fluttered into the garden like expensive birds, all grace and carefully measured affection. I watched them from my station, folding my hands neatly in front of me, shoulders straight, lips neutral. Years of practice made the posture easy. Then I saw them. Graham stood near the entryway, laughing with two city councilmen, gesturing like he owned the language of power. He wore a navy jacket that matched the estate's shutters, tailored to the inch, of course. Meredith followed shortly after, wrapped in a pearl-stitched gown with a floral sash. She looked like a bridal magazine cover, radiant and hollow. She sipped from a crystal flute and let her laughter glide just above everyone else's like a practiced note. Franklin and Celeste flanked them, standing like monuments. He in his pale suit, she in powder blue with diamonds dripping from her neck. Their expressions serene, polished, the kind of calm that only comes from believing you've already won. There were speeches, all of them crafted like campaign slogans. The Bellamy Foundation, they said, had transformed lives. It was rooted in empathy and community leadership. I listened as Franklin spoke about opening their hearts and home to those in need, as if the walls themselves hadn't whispered cruelties my entire childhood. No one looked at me, no one saw me. I walked from table to table, refilling glasses, bowing my head just enough to keep the illusion intact. A woman gestured toward the champagne and said without glancing up, "Could you be quicker next time, honey?" I nodded. No words, just service. A man in a seersucker blazer turned and offered a lazy smile. "Didn't expect the help to look so exotic tonight," he murmured. I gave him the same look I used to give Meredith when she corrected my pronunciation, blank and deadly. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden veins across the manicured lawn, I felt the moment approaching, the tipping point. It came faster than I expected. A wine glass slipped from a guest's hand near the center fountain, shattering like crystal rain against the patio stone. Without hesitation, I knelt to pick up the shards, moving quickly, silently. The woman who dropped it apologized softly, but before I could respond, Meredith's voice cut through the air like a knife dipped in sugar. "Don't worry," she called with a smile too sweet to be kind. "She's used to cleaning up after others." The laughter that followed was brittle, tight, and unmistakably cruel. It scattered across the tables like dust. My fingers trembled only slightly as I picked up the last of the glass. A sliver sliced across my palm. Blood rose to the surface, bright and deliberate. I stood slowly, gripping the pieces in my hand like fragile truths. I said nothing. I walked back into the catering tent, rinsed the cut under cold water, wrapped it in a towel, and waited. That was when it happened. The real breaking point. Franklin raised his hand for attention, standing at the head of the garden platform. His voice still carried the courtroom weight, even when dulled by a few glasses of wine. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, smiling like a man who believed he was in complete control, "we'd like to offer a symbolic moment, a gesture of history and reflection." I froze. He turned toward me, eyes gleaming with a condescending smirk. "Naomi, would you join us for a small performance?" His tone made it clear it wasn't a request. Before I could move, two young event staffers, oblivious, obedient, gently took me by the arms. "We'll make it quick," one said, as if that changed the meaning of what they were doing. They led me to a decorative wooden column near the fountain, meant to evoke Southern architecture, some imagined nostalgia. They turned me to face the crowd, and then they tied a length of silk rope around my wrists. I stood there, back straight, arms bound, the beige dress limp against my frame. My skin glistened in the dying light. Somewhere, a phone camera clicked. Franklin raised his glass. "A reminder," he said, "of how far we've come." Laughter again. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I locked my eyes on the edge of the horizon, steady and silent, and let the humiliation wash over me without letting it drown me. Inside, something was burning. Not shame. No, I was done with shame. It was precision. It was patience. I had waited my whole life for this moment, and just then, in the quiet that followed their performance, I heard it. The smooth growl of an engine approaching up the stone path. Low. Deliberate. Familiar. I didn't need to turn around. I already knew. Elijah was here. The engine's hum cut through the garden like a warning. Low, steady, expensive. It wasn't just a car pulling up to a party. It was a shift in atmosphere. I didn't have to turn around to know. Elijah had arrived, and the crowd felt it. Conversation faltered mid-sentence. Forks hovered inches from lips. Laughter thinned and then vanished altogether. Even Franklin's self-satisfied smirk began to falter as the black Rolls-Royce crept to a halt beside the garden's gravel path, sleek and silent like a blade unsheathed. The driver stepped out first, dressed in a dark suit, face unreadable. He moved to the rear door and opened it with reverence. Elijah Hart emerged like a storm held together by custom stitching. Tall, calm, every movement deliberate, his navy suit clung to him like it had been cut from midnight itself. No flash, no drama. Just presence, solid, still, undeniable. His eyes scanned the garden like he was looking for something real in a room built of lies. And then he saw me. There I stood, bound to a decorative column with silk rope, a blood-stained towel still wrapped around my palm, my beige server's dress doing little to hide the sting in my spine. My wrists burned, my chest rose slowly, but my face remained composed. Elijah didn't rush, he didn't yell, he didn't ask for permission. He walked. Through the guests, through their stunned expressions, through the wall of polite power that had mocked me all my life. Their eyes followed him like gravity had shifted, and no one quite knew where to stand anymore. When he reached me, he didn't speak right away. He knelt, gently, without spectacle, and pulled a slim blade from the inner lining of his jacket. The silver flashed in the last of the sunlight as he sliced clean through the silk. My wrists came free. He took my hand with the same tenderness he'd shown me the night we first danced in the rain. His fingers found the wound beneath the towel, peeled it back with care. When he saw the raw skin, his expression didn't shift, but I felt his fury radiate like heat. He kissed the wound. Gasps rippled through the crowd, audible, real. Elijah turned slowly to face them. His voice, when it came, was low but sharp. "This woman," he said, "is my wife." The word wife hit like thunder. I could feel the entire crowd recoil like someone had yanked the rug out from beneath their feet. Meredith's champagne flute trembled in her hand. Graham's jaw twitched. Celeste's hand clutched her pearls so tightly the string looked ready to snap. Franklin took a slow, measured step forward. But Elijah wasn't done. "I want to know," he said, louder now, "who thought tying her to a post like livestock was acceptable?" Silence. Utter, bottomless silence. No one answered. Not even Franklin, who suddenly looked like a man unsure of his own reflection. Elijah pulled a folded document from the inside of his jacket and held it in the air. 3 months ago, he continued, this estate went into default. Unpaid taxes, missed deadlines, panicked calls to every lender in a 50-mile radius. Eyes darted. Guests began whispering. "Elijah!" Meredith stepped forward, her voice thin. He held up a hand. She froze. Every one of those calls, he said, was answered by her. Naomi, the woman you dressed like a servant and used like a shield. She paid your debts, with her emergency fund, with her savings. She sold her car. She gave up her own future just to save the past you keep parading as a legacy. Franklin's face had gone white. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. She didn't ask for help, Elijah said. She came to me with a plan. She asked if I could buy the estate quietly so your family wouldn't lose face, so your name wouldn't be dragged through the dirt you buried her in. He handed the deed to Franklin, whose fingers shook as he unfolded it. Take a look, Elijah said. You signed it. The wind caught the corners of the paper. The gold seal gleamed under the twilight. She owns this house now, Elijah said simply. And she owns her story. My chest rose with a breath I didn't know I'd been holding for 15 years. She didn't want this moment. She hoped, foolishly, that if she kept you safe, you might see her. You never did, so now she sees herself. He turned toward me, and so do I. I stood taller. The pain in my wrist melted beneath his touch. The sting of humiliation became weightless. Elijah looked out over the stunned, silent crowd. You didn't raise a failure, he said. You raised a woman who kept the lights on while you turned your back. A woman who rebuilt your name with her bare hands while you erased hers from invitations. No one dared respond. The silence was thicker than any speech. It was the kind of silence that follows a funeral, not of a person, but of a lie. A few guests began to back away, eyes lowered. Some left glasses half full on linen-covered tables, not knowing where to put their hands or their shame. Franklin finally looked up from the deed. You tricked us, he said, barely above a whisper. No, I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was calm, clear, unshakable. I saved you, and you thanked me by tying me to a post. Celeste covered her mouth. Meredith took another step back. Graham disappeared behind a hedge. I stepped forward, Elijah beside me. The garden hushed like a cathedral holding its breath. I was never the servant, I said. I was the scaffold. The silent beam you leaned on when everything else started to rot. But scaffolds aren't meant to stay forever. I turned to Elijah. He nodded once. This ends now, he said. You have 15 minutes to gather your things and leave. Franklin blinked. Leave? You don't own this place anymore, Elijah said. Not the house, not the land, not the narrative. You've lost the story you built, and the person you wrote out of it has just taken back the pen. The rope lay in a puddle of twilight behind me, and I didn't feel bound anymore. I felt free. The silence that followed Elijah's final words was heavier than any scream. It blanketed the garden, pressing into the folds of linen napkins and the creases in the guests' perfectly tailored suits. For a moment, everything was suspended. The laughter, the lies, the performance. All of it shattered at once. And in its place, a strange stillness bloomed. I stood beside Elijah, my wrists free, my spine unbent, watching the people who had raised me like a cause instead of a child now recoil like shadows at sunrise. Franklin Bellamy, the man who had once declared my presence as proof of progress to donors, now held a deed he couldn't comprehend. Celeste stood frozen, her pale blue sheath dress fluttering slightly in the breeze, like even the wind was trying to pull her away from this scene. I didn't say another word. I didn't have to. The truth had already landed, and it landed like a thunderclap. Around us, the crowd began to stir. Some guests fumbled with their phones, uncertain whether to pretend the last 10 minutes hadn't happened or to quietly delete the photos they'd snapped of me tied to that post. Others whispered behind manicured hands, avoiding my gaze like it burned. The string quartet had long since stopped playing. The only sound now was the gentle trickle of the garden fountain, still murmuring as if it hadn't just witnessed a reckoning. Elijah's hand brushed mine, grounding me. He didn't rush me. He didn't push. He just waited, his presence solid and calm like an anchor dropped into chaotic seas. "Are you ready?" he murmured. I nodded. We walked together slowly, not toward the front of the house, but toward the back. Away from the spectacle, away from the eyes. My steps were firm. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't fleeing. I was leaving, and that's different. We paused beneath the pergola, where fairy lights still dangled like tiny ghosts blinking gently in the dusk. The sun had dropped low behind the hedges, casting long golden lines across the lawn. It should have felt surreal. It should have felt like something out of a movie, but it didn't. It felt real. So real, in fact, that I felt more alive than I had in decades. I sat down on the stone bench, and Elijah joined me, his fingers finding mine again. I could feel the steady beat of his pulse and his grip. Quiet, unfazed, loyal. I thought I'd feel rage, I said finally. My voice was soft, not broken. But it's not that. It's something quieter. Freedom? He asked. I looked out across the garden. The chairs still arranged in perfect symmetry. The champagne glasses still glinting in the light. The silk rope coiled at the base of the post like a discarded prop from a play that had lost its audience. No, I said. Something deeper than that. Stillness. The kind that comes after the fire. Elijah said nothing, but his thumb traced a slow line across the back of my hand. We sat there watching the last sliver of sunlight fade. And for once, I wasn't calculating where to stand or what tone to use or whether I was being too much. For the first time in a lifetime, I just was. When we finally rose, it wasn't out of exhaustion. It was purpose. Clarity. We walked through the house like explorers mapping a land that had once been forbidden. The foyer still gleamed with polished marble, the chandelier catching reflections like fireflies. The dining room table, long, cold, and heavy, stood untouched. But the air had changed. It no longer belonged to them. Their voices no longer echoed here. The weight had lifted. We passed the living room where I'd once been told I didn't sit like a young lady, the spot where I was told my laugh was a bit too loud, the piano that I wasn't allowed to play because it's just for show. Elijah paused beside the fireplace, where photos lined the mantel. He picked up one frame, the Bellamies in their prim perfection. Meredith's practiced tilt, Graham's steely gaze, Celeste's soft smile, Franklin's patriarchal pose, and me. I stood stiffly off to the side, wearing a dress someone else picked, my smile wide and desperate. "Do you want to keep it?" Elijah asked gently. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I turned it over and set it face down on the table. "No," I said, "that girl doesn't live here anymore." He nodded. He understood. That night, we didn't unpack. We didn't try to fill the silence with music or noise. We opened the windows. Let the night air in. I stood barefoot on the kitchen tile, tracing its coolness with my toes while Elijah made tea and hummed off-key. It was ordinary. It was beautiful. The next morning, I woke up to birdsong and the scent of rain-washed grass, the kind of morning that usually goes unnoticed until something inside you finally calms down enough to hear it. I lay in bed for a long time, my hand resting on my chest, just marveling at the absence of tension. I wasn't bracing for the next insult. I wasn't rehearsing my next apology. I wasn't waiting to be told who I was allowed to be. I simply breathed. In the days that followed, Elijah and I began clearing out the house, not out of anger, not to erase the past, but to reclaim the space, to exhale the dust of years lived in silence. We boxed up Celeste's silver, Franklin's law books, Meredith's boxes of awards and vision boards. All of it went into storage, not out of spite, just because none of it had power anymore. In the attic, we found a trunk labeled Naomi's Things. I hadn't known it existed. Inside were notebooks I'd kept as a teenager, drawings I'd forgotten, journals I'd written in green pen. On the last page of one I'd written, "Things I'll do when I'm free." The list was short. Learn to paint a sunset. Laugh until I cry. Sleep without checking the hallway. Fall in love with silence. Elijah stood behind me, reading over my shoulder. When I reached the last item, he whispered, "Well, we've done at least 3. I laughed, really laughed, the kind that shook in my belly, the kind that felt like medicine. "Let's start painting," he said, his voice warm. "You didn't say they had to be good sunsets." And just like that, we turned the old study into an art room. He built shelves. I filled them with colors I hadn't dared touch in years. My first painting wasn't a sunset, it was the view from the back patio, after the rope was gone, after the crowd had vanished. Just the garden, just the sky, just the beginning. And I painted it like a woman who had finally claimed her place in the world, unbound, unafraid, and unfinished. We started having dinner at the long oak table, the same table where I used to sit in silence while Franklin waxed poetic about legal ethics and Celeste complimented Meredith's graceful restraint, the same table where my elbows were once corrected, my voice dismissed, my laughter called too much. Now it held candles that flickered softly at dusk, plates filled with food Elijah and I had cooked together, sometimes badly, sometimes beautifully, and conversation that flowed without strategy or self-defense. There were no expectations here, no performance. We didn't talk to impress, we talked to connect. We laughed, not because everything was perfect, but because for the first time in our lives, we had room to be imperfect. One night, Elijah came home later than usual. His tie was loosened, his eyes tired but bright with something he hadn't yet shared. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a small brass key. I turned it in my palm, puzzled. "I bought us a cabin," he said with a quiet smile. "Near Lakeview, no neighbors. Just trees, stars, and us, for when this place feels too heavy." I looked at the key, then at him. "You're not trying to run away from this, are you?" "No," he said, stepping closer. "I just want you to know you have choices now, not chains." That night I stood barefoot on the back porch and looked out over the garden. The lights were dim. The air was thick with the sweet scent of blooming night jasmine. The column where they had tied me still stood, though the silk rope was long gone. In the silence, I saw it for what it truly was, not a monument to shame, but to transformation. This wasn't the place I had suffered anymore. This was the place I had survived. And more than that, it was now the place where I had begun. In the weeks that followed, I moved through the house differently. Not cautiously, not like a guest, like a woman who belonged. I'd catch myself reaching for a glass, hesitating out of old habit, then remembering there was no one left to correct me. No Meredith watching from behind her wine. No Celeste subtly adjusting the napkin in front of me to match some imaginary standard of etiquette. No Franklin arching an eyebrow when I dared to offer a dissenting opinion. It was strange at first how absence could feel like presence. Even the walls felt different, softer, quieter, like they'd been holding their breath for years and were finally allowed to exhale. One afternoon, while sorting through the last of the storage room, I found an old family photo tucked in the back of a drawer. It was one of the rare formal portraits where I was included. Meredith stood center, of course, flanked by Franklin and Celeste. Graham off to the side, looking vaguely bored. And me, a step behind, dressed in soft beige, my smile wide, unnatural. A little girl trying to blend in with a family that had no intention of letting her. I stared at it for a long time. Then I pulled out a pen and wrote on the back, "Thank you for teaching me how to disappear." I had to, so I could learn how to come back stronger. I placed the photo in an envelope and left it on the mantel, face down. I didn't need to send it. I didn't need them to see it. It was for me. A ceremony. A release. A few days later, a letter arrived. Cream-colored envelope. Gold-embossed lettering. I already knew what it was before I opened it. An invitation to Meredith's engagement party. The envelope was addressed to Miss A. Bellamy. They hadn't even spelled my name right. Elijah opened it, skimmed the card, and raised one eyebrow. "Well, they're persistent." I laughed, not bitterly, but with a kind of lightness I hadn't felt in years. "I'm not going." He tilted his head. "Then what will you send?" I walked to my desk, pulled out a photo. The one of us at the Global Innovation Conference, arms around each other, laughing as he held his award, and I was whispering something in his ear that made him laugh so hard he dropped his speech. On the back, I wrote in silver ink, "From the girl you tried to erase. Thank you for setting me free." I sealed the envelope and dropped it off at the mailbox the next morning on our walk through the neighborhood. A neighbor waved at us. A golden retriever barked from across the lawn. Life, it seemed, kept going. And now, so did I. Each morning began with something simple: watering the herbs on the kitchen windowsill, stepping into the garden barefoot, sipping tea with Elijah on the porch while he hummed some off-key tune from the 70s. The silence between us was no longer the kind that wrapped around my throat and kept me small. It was wide and safe, like a room I could stretch out in. The kind of silence that made space for creativity, for presence, for peace. I started painting again. I'd forgotten how colors had once spoken to me, how I used to imagine feelings as shapes, anger as jagged lines, joy as curved light, sorrow as deep washes of midnight blue. The first thing I painted was the view from the back patio. No rope, no guests, just the sky, the open garden, and the stone column half covered in ivy. I painted it the way I saw it now, not as the site of my humiliation, but the altar of my rebirth. I placed the canvas on the mantel in place of the old family photo. and every time I passed it, I smiled. Not because everything was fixed, but because I finally understood I didn't have to be part of a legacy that didn't include me. I was building something new, a legacy of my own, of resilience, of truth, of love. And it didn't need to be written in gold foil or embossed invitations. It just needed to be lived, one unchained breath at a time. The morning sun filtered through the linen curtains, brushing against my cheek like a whisper. I opened my eyes slowly. My body still nestled in the warmth of our cotton sheets, the scent of lavender and something faintly citrus lingering in the air. For a moment, I simply lay there listening. Not for footsteps in the hallway or the clicking of judgmental heels on marble, just for life. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of a mourning dove, and the soft clatter of pans downstairs. Elijah was humming again, off-key, like always. I smiled. I rose without urgency, without the weight of performance pressing down on my shoulders. No mental rehearsal of my tone, no checklist of how to shrink myself to fit into someone else's story. Just the luxury of being present in my own skin. I padded barefoot into the kitchen, where Elijah stood in his worn college sweatshirt, stirring scrambled eggs and tapping a rhythm on the stovetop. He looked up, eyes crinkling at the corners. "Morning, Mrs. Hart." "Morning, Mr. Hart." He handed me a mug of coffee, exactly the way I liked it. 2 sugars, splash of oat milk. No words were needed. There was something holy in the way he moved around me, not out of caution, but out of knowing. He didn't hover. He didn't lead. He simply moved with me. That week, we finished clearing out the last remnants of the Bellamy past. We donated Celeste's porcelain collection, packed Franklin's legal journals into boxes that we dropped at the local law school, and gently wrapped up Meredith's old trophies, still gleaming, still hollow. We placed them in the garage, not out of malice, but out of truth. They no longer held meaning here. We repainted the hallways. I chose a warm amber for the living room and a smoky slate for the bedroom. Elijah let me go wild with color, even in the kitchen, where deep teal now kissed the cabinets. "If we're gonna live here," he said, "let's live here." One afternoon, while sorting through a pile of forgotten attic boxes, I came across something that made me pause. Tucked beneath a stack of dusty piano sheet music was a faded notebook. The cover was cracked, the edges curled. But when I opened it, I instantly recognized the handwriting, mine from a lifetime ago. At the top of the first page, in green ink, I had written, "Things I'll do when I'm free." I sank to the floor, the sunlight slanting through the attic window, in golden lines as I read each line out loud. Learn to paint the sunset. Dance in the rain without apologizing. Sleep without checking the hallway. Speak without shrinking. Fall in love with someone who listens. Laugh until I cry, breathe and not brace. By the time I finished reading, Elijah had appeared beside me, kneeling quietly. He reached for my hand, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. "You've done all of them," he said. I shook my head, smiling through tears I didn't know were there. "I never painted the sunset." "Then let's fix that." That night, I stood in front of a blank canvas in the art room we had built together. The window was open, and the sky outside was erupting in shades of coral, lavender, and fire. I dipped my brush in orange, then pink, then purple, letting instinct take the lead. There were no rules, no critiques waiting around the corner, no voice in my head telling me I was doing it wrong. It wasn't perfect. It was mine. And when I stepped back, I felt something settle inside me. A small, quiet truth that needed no validation. I was home. A few days later, another envelope arrived, thicker this time. The return address was Meredith's. I considered throwing it away unopened, but curiosity nudged me forward. Inside was a handwritten letter, pressed with the faint scent of rosewater. "Naomi, you've always been stronger than I knew how to be. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know what to ask for. But I wanted you to know that the house isn't the same without you. It's never been." There was no apology. Not really. But maybe it was the closest she could come. Maybe, in her own fragile way, she was trying to pull at a thread of something real. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside my paints. Not because I needed it. Not because it changed anything. But because I was done burning bridges just to feel warm. I didn't have to respond. I didn't have to do anything. That was the gift of freedom. Choice. A month passed. Then 2. We spent weekends hiking in the mountains, picnicking beneath whispering trees, sipping wine beside the lake cabin Elijah had bought. I watched him chop firewood with a half grin and bare arms, and I thought, this is the life I dreamed of when I was invisible. Not wealth, not grandeur, but belonging. Peace. A love that didn't ask me to disappear. Every morning, I watered the plants on the windowsill. I painted. I called old friends. I volunteered at the community center. I mentored a girl named Brielle, who reminded me too much of the girl I used to be. Brilliant, brave, and taught to stay small. I told her, don't wait for permission to shine. She nodded, tears in her eyes. She understood. And then one morning, while stirring pancake batter, Elijah said, you know what we never did? What? Throw a party. I raised an eyebrow. A party? Not for them, he said. For us. So we did. We invited our friends, real ones, the people who had shown up, time and again. We lit candles all over the garden, turned on music, grilled food until the stars came out. I wore a dress the color of sunset and danced barefoot on the grass. At one point, someone asked me to make a toast. I hesitated, old fear brushing against me like a ghost, but then Elijah's hand found mine beneath the table. I stood, glass in hand, and I said, to the girls who were told to sit down, to the women who learned to stand anyway, to the voices that were silenced, and to the songs they're finally singing, and to this, the life I didn't think I'd live, but I do, and I love it. The garden exploded in applause, but I wasn't waiting for it. I was already free, and if I could whisper anything to the girl I once was, the girl with wrists bound and hope flickering like a candle in a storm, I would tell her this: you made it, not just out, but forward. And your best chapter, it wasn't stolen. It was waiting. Now, every time I pass the old stone column in the garden, I don't look away. I look at it and smile, because it's not a symbol of shame anymore. It's a marker, a monument to the day I stopped surviving someone else's story and started living my own. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of Naomi's story. If this journey touched something in your heart, it's because stories like hers aren't just fiction. They echo real pain, real silence, and real courage. Naomi's life teaches us one powerful truth. You do not have to stay small just because others are afraid of your light. You don't need permission to reclaim your voice, your space, or your future. Sometimes the strongest kind of revenge is peace. So wherever you are, whether you're watching this in a quiet apartment in Chicago, a small town in Texas, or across the ocean, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I truly love hearing from all of you. If this story moved you, please make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Every video is crafted to inspire, empower, and remind you that healing is possible, and your story is far from over. Again, thank you for being here. And remember, you are allowed to begin again.